rather than forget your care.
Prostitutes working the woods, drug dealers working the woods.
In Seattle.
The reason people care about the heroin crisis is not because poor people were dying. Middle class and rich white kids were dying. The world got turned upside down.
Welcome to the future and all the wonders of the 21st century.
In my experience, people who have gotten clean, it doesn't happen unless you hit bottom.
Have fun with the happy-go-lucky crowd.
These are people, and they deserve to be alive.
See the fabulous city of tomorrow.
Our Seattle City Council continues, and even our mayor continues to call this a homeless crisis.
It's the big thrilling adventure of a lifetime.
And what's amazing to me is that the media across the board says this is intolerable, this is awful, this shouldn't be happening, and they've all covered it. Every network, every TV station has all covered it. But the city officials, they haven't done anything.
In Seattle.
In many ways, Seattle was supposed to be this place of prosperity. Seattle was supposed to be this shining beacon of what the possibilities were for your life, raising your kids, your family. This place where you can go to kind of start a new life. And it's this technological marvel of a city. Seattle, in my mind, always had this kind of loftiness to it. It's a beautiful city. It was supposed to be a city that was incredibly promising. I don't know. It's interesting. There's a lot going on here that's being actively ignored by the politicians, even the people, almost kind of a desire to just ignore the very blatant but then yet elusive reality that is a heroin epidemic disguising itself as a homeless epidemic. I guess that's what I'm here to find out, is just to get a real understanding of why that is.
So yeah, we're gonna head on out here to, this is where the exchange is, the actual exchange itself, the needle exchange.
Okay.
You have to knock before you go out, or you might just,
run into
bonk somebody. Yeah, right there's the exchange. Right here, what you see, these are all the different programs that are featured here in this building.
So if let's say I wanted to exchange needles, what is that? How does that look?
You know, we decided that to do our harm reduction, our method of harm reduction, what we do is we give you 300 needles. That way you have plenty to give to your acquaintances, friends, strangers, whoever might need one. That way everyone is as safe as humanly possible. And everyone is, for lack of a better term, they're being the best drug user they could possibly be at that moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as safe injection. So again, semantics and rhetoric really matter here, and that agenda has been pushed for a long time. I think the reality is, you know, obviously there's a lot of folks that are really pushing for, you know, safe injection sites to be all over the city.
So I work downtown, and I take the bus to 3rd and Pine, and in the morning before that they've done the street cleaning, there are piles of needles that at least have been swept near all the garbage cans, but I mean, there are mounds of used needles in the morning.
I coach baseball. We have to check the fields before every game because we find needles out on the fields. We find them everywhere. And they're being found all over the city, in parks, baseball fields, you name it. That's where they're being found. It's enabling behavior.
There is an attempt to normalize this drug use, when instead we should be focusing on treatment paths.
Every 36 hours, someone dies from a heroin or opioid drug overdose in King County.
Kids in high school are actually talking about using heroin and like bragging about it like they, you know, drank a few beers last night.
The reason people care about the heroin crisis is not because poor people were dying, because middle class and rich white kids were dying. The world got turned upside down. The reason I do the work I do is because I was living in an abandoned building, and one of my very close friends was laying next to me, and we both used heroin, and he died. And I woke up, and I was kind of tired of the abuse. I was tired of the conditions people living on the streets, and I wanted to do something. And so I went to all these nonprofits, and I said, I want to change the conditions, I want to do this. And they said, you're a homeless junkie, the only thing you're going to do is die. And there was an illegal Canadian named Bob Quinn who started a needle exchange, and he did it because he worked for a hospice, and he was having a lot of HIV patients, and he was tired of the people he really loved dying. And he looked into it and saw that if you did syringe exchange and you gave people clean syringes, you could stop the spread of HIV.
I've lost a lot of family and a lot of friends to incarceration, to overdose, and to just a lot of other preventable experiences and consequences associated with stigma and judgment that we have here in our society.
With the number of people that you've dealt with, that you've come across, what tends to be the most consistent thing that tends to ail a lot of the people? Like some of the things that may have pushed them in the direction that they ended up going into?
Stigma.
Really?
Period. Judgment. A lot of the homeless youth that we're seeing right now, you know, they're there because of parental judgment, because of not feeling comfortable to come to people and tell them what they're dealing with or what they want or the issues that they're facing. It's a system that's hard to navigate through, especially for someone who doesn't have a cell phone, who doesn't have a home, who doesn't have an address.
For me, I was the witness to the pain and suffering of a generation. And we've now made it a little harder to overdose. And every little thing we do, that has to be the goal. We have to keep people alive, because I don't want another generation like myself who know more dead people than living people.
These are people, and they deserve to be alive, and they deserve to have access to these options in naloxone and syringe access harm reduction services.
So tell me a little bit about your history.
Well, I grew up a little bit north of Seattle, and my dad died when I was 17, and I kind of went off the rails a little bit. Then I started taking pills, and that was where I really connected with the drug thing. The opiate pills was like, that feels good. Yeah. I really like that. And so when the needle showed up in front of me, I was like, yeah, why not? And then I quit. In 1999, I finally crashed and burned or hit bottom, is what they say in the program.
How hard was the initial sobriety process?
It was pretty tough.
You know, I've been getting various perspectives on the drug culture, the drug epidemic, whatever word of choice people wanted to label it. I guess the homelessness, so to speak. And then, there are several approaches that a lot of people feel like they have that will fix the issue. Are there any approaches that stand out to you that you're kind of like, not so much, coming from your experience?
Well, here's my feeling on that thing. And in my experience, probably 95% or more of people who have gotten clean, it doesn't happen unless you hit bottom. Unless you crash and burn and get just your ass beat bad.
Yeah.
That's the point where you can change directions. Yeah. That's the point where you can start picking up those pieces and putting a person back together into some kind of functional form. It doesn't happen any other way. I've never seen it. I've never seen anybody that's shooting heroin or shooting coke or smoking crack or meth. I've never seen anybody say, gee, this is kind of unhealthy. I'm gonna stop doing this and start juicing. And that's what makes it so hard, I think, for government to address this problem.
Gotcha.
But they're giving them these little shacks to live in, and they're giving them these things, and it just doesn't quite make sense to me, because it's not helping them hit bottom.
So it's safe to say you're not probably the biggest fan of, say, the idea of a needle exchange?
Well, yeah, if it's an exchange.
Gotcha.
Right? But the needle exchange used to be, you'd bring in 2 needles, used ones, and they'd give you 2 new ones. Bring in 10, you'd get 10. Bring a grocery bag full, like I used to do, they'd give you a grocery bag full. Now, they don't require the drug addicts to bring their needles back. So, that's why they're all over the city.
Oh man, it's pitiful. Yeah.
Palmer Field.
It's very bad. It's very bad.
Lives on the street.
Heroin. Heroin is the #1 thing out here.
We found out today the state of Washington set a new record. For the 5th year in a row, the number of heroin overdoses went up. More than 200 people died last year. More than 15,000 people checked into rehab.
Seattle has a new look for homeless encampments. Now, next door to this home, on a typical residential street, and behind this fence, sits a homeless village.
For weeks now, a lot of concerned residents have reached out to me. They say they just simply do not feel safe. They feel that the laws are not being enforced when it comes to unauthorized encampments and homeless people committing crimes.
So within the encampment, they're allowed to be active users. So when they're screened to go in there, a lot of shelters in Seattle have requirements that you cannot actively use if you're going to live within this shelter. So they can be active users. They're also given needles for free, but they're not allowed to use the needles within the encampment. And so they go out into our neighborhood and leave needles everywhere.
What are your thoughts on the idea of handing out, clean needles, I guess?
So I'm against it. One, you can't actually monitor if they're using those needles only once. They could also be sharing them. And I don't condone drug use because I think it leads to long-term consequences. You have organ failure, you have mental illness, and the longer someone is on drugs, the more likely they are to develop that mental illness. And so there's no sense of urgency to treat the problem. And with that comes a whole host of other issues, both to the person themselves and to the people within the community. Now it's a daily part of living in my neighborhood where anything can get stolen.
So where are the police with respect to this? Because it seems like a free-for-all, essentially.
Yeah, I think our police are doing the best that they can given the current political climate, and they're resourcing. There's really not much they can do if they're not going to prosecute people for property crimes, open drug use, theft. Right, to feed their habits. Then it just attracts more crime.
Yeah, I don't know where you stand on the issue of firearms in the Second Amendment, but it seems to me if you're going to have a condition in an environment like you're living in right now at your house, where you have groups of people who pretty much can do whatever they want without any retribution as far as police enforcement, I think it only makes sense that, okay, well, if you're waking up the people in your backyard, you probably, I don't know if you own a gun or not, you probably want some form of protection.
Yeah, I actually, after waking up to the guy next to my bedroom window, it's like, okay, well, it's now time to get bear spray or get my concealed weapons permit at this point.
And so was it that was your catalyst to really kind of start considering that up until that point?
Yeah, I grew up in a pretty rough neighborhood, and so the fact that I now feel unsafe speaks volumes to how my neighborhood has declined in terms of its safety in the past 2 years. Ever since they put in that encampment, crime has increased 103% year over year and year to date. And this was given to me by SPD's data-driven team. Year to date has increased by 100% as of May 11th. Right, and so that's a substantial. That's no longer anecdotal.
Yeah, that's substantial as hell.
That's substantial.
So about 4 or 5 years ago, we started having issues with vagrants hanging out around the cemetery, in the cemetery, and then it evolved and escalated, where we started having prostitutes working the woods, drug dealers working the woods. And then when the city of Seattle started changing its policies on how to deal with these vagrants and letting them have the run of the city, these RVs started moving in across the street line, and they brought more drugs. They brought drug use, they brought more sex, they brought
to the cemetery.
To the cemetery. I don't know why this is such a hot spot for hangout for that kind of stuff, but that's what they started doing here, probably because nobody bothers them at night.
So have you had any safety issues, so to speak?
So for Memorial Day, every year we have the kids of the synagogue come out and put American flags in the ground for all the veterans that are buried here and next door. They do that with the cemeteries, all the Jewish cemeteries in town. It's a big event that we've been running for about 10 years. And what happened was we were concerned about the kids' safety because the event is in the evening time when they're done with school.
Gotcha.
So we got a few former Israeli soldiers to come out to the cemetery to guard the kids. It's a good thing they were here because some prostitutes showed up and tried to get in while the event was going on.
Seriously?
Oh yeah.
Wow.
What's amazing to me is that the media across the board says this is intolerable, this is awful, this shouldn't be happening, and they've all covered it. Every network, every TV station has all covered it. But the city officials, they haven't done anything.
For years, Beaker Holim Cemetery, the Seattle Historic Sephardic Cemetery, and Evergreen Washelli across the street have been dealing with cleaning up tons of trash, needles, even human waste left on cemetery grounds, even on headstones. The result, they say, of homeless people and drug addicts living in campers and tents.
A little disappointed with the response, the fact that the council member did not show up.
That's so interesting to me because you can hear them talk about all types of other things, like we were talking earlier about a recent law that they just passed in terms of like gun safes and all these other laws that are pertaining more so to, I guess, the gun issue. Yet you have this problem here, which they're completely ignoring.
Well, the city got involved over the gun issue with the cemetery. They didn't like the idea that we were going to bring guns and protect our cemetery, that we were hiring security guards.
That's where they drew the line.
And Jews have guns? Nope, can't have that.
Yeah.
We don't care about the homeless people in the cemetery, we don't care about the drug use, we don't care about the prostitutes, but Jews protecting their own cemetery with guns? That's where we draw the line. And all of a sudden things started.
Which is ironic because this is an open carry state.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
And they have, you know, it's funny to me because, you know, I've made this argument before. The idea of the Second Amendment and being able to own and carry a firearm is essentially symbolic of self-reliance. And here you have a place that's sacred to you in your community, and you decided to take it upon yourself within the law to defend that sacred ground with firearms, but yet the people who are supposed to be in charge and to reinforce those said laws that allow you to do that come here to prevent you from doing it.
Well, I feel bad because the cops have gotten a bad rap. They want to do their jobs.
Gotcha.
Some of them actually take their breaks right outside the cemetery and hang out here just to be a deterrent to the people.
Gotcha.
It's not them, it's the elected officials who are stopping them from doing their jobs. People like Kashama Sawant demonize the cops on a regular basis, and it's not fair to them because they want to do their jobs, and the city's doing everything in their power to stop them from doing their jobs.
So what were some of the policy changes that Seattle took or made that kind of pretty much opened the floodgates?
Seattle stopped enforcing its own laws.
Okay.
They stopped enforcing laws on parking. They stopped enforcing laws on panhandling and transients and any of that kind of stuff. They stopped enforcing laws on drug use. They stopped enforcing laws on drug dealing. And unfortunately, the police have been given a kind of hands-off order on the homeless. By that, it means they're going to be punished or investigated if they're dealing with the homeless by city officials. They've been demonized by the city.
Is this even real love? Is this even real love?
The city government has not looked into what's worked in other cities. I lived in New York under Giuliani, and I watched the broken windows thing in action. And it showed how you can clean up a city if you put the right resources in the right places. And if you go after low-level crimes, then there's a ladder effect, and it works its way through everything. And this city doesn't seem interested in any of that. They just seem like they want to reinvent the wheel, and they want to create it themselves. And I understand that Seattle's a technological place where they created everything, but none of the stuff they're doing is working because the homeless problem is only getting worse. When this whole thing first started with camping in public parks, the homeless number was, I think, in 4,000 or 5,000 according to their numbers. It's now 12,000. 12,000 according to their numbers, which are probably wrong. It's probably more than that. Right. So this problem has gotten so massive, they don't even know how to deal with it anymore, except for, well, you give us more money, we'll figure it out. It's not always about the money. Sometimes it's just about enforcing the laws that you already have on the books.
That's funny. There's so many parallels that I could draw, and I'm trying not to force the issue, but I can't help it when you start thinking about things like the gun issue.
These tyrants cannot succeed.
She says gun owners need to prepare for a fight to protect their right.
We talk about the idea of, you know, why are we focused on creating laws that take guns out of the hands of people who we're not worried about? Right. And the people who are worried about just end up being the only people that have them. And they have them and continue to do the things that they do, but yet the laws that we have on the books we don't enforce. And when we don't enforce them and then something happens, we say, well, we need more laws.
Shame on Senator Saldana. Shame on her. These tyrants cannot succeed.
So the question here is, how do we balance that very real constitutional right with a public safety crisis?
MS-13 has moved into Seattle. That's a drug cartel crime syndicate.
Very familiar
They
with
moved
them.
into Seattle because they know that nobody's going to do anything about it.
Gotcha.
And they've set up camp here, and they've set up shop here. And the drug running and everything has gotten completely out of control. And they know nobody's going to stop them. Nobody's going to do anything. The police department is understaffed because the cops are switching to other departments because they're constantly being demonized by the elected officials. Why would anybody want to work in that environment?
Let's talk about the criminal side of things for a little bit. What kind of things have you been seeing?
I will go to the grocery store right down the street. And it used to be a 24-hour grocery store. They now close it at 2 o'clock in the morning. They've also closed another entrance. There are 24-hour security guards. Even with those measures in place, it really is a safety issue that the security guards are there for. They are not prosecuting or trying to stop any criminal activity. I go grocery shopping pretty much every single time I do. Somebody is walking in, stealing a bunch of stuff, and walking straight out. There is nothing that they're allowed to do. The actual employees are told not to do anything for their own safety. It is actually a store policy that is pretty universal across all of the stores that we're talking about, not even just grocery stores. We're talking about even, department stores and the likes. And, you see thefts out in the open, robberies, burglaries happening, police not being able to respond in time due to staffing issues that we have here and some policies, in place that are preventing that as well. So, it's, if you want to be a criminal, Seattle's a very good place to be.
I'm going home. I got 40 ounces and 2 couches. I'm here all alone.
I don't want anybody to think that I thought by coming out here that I would somehow solve these issues. What I wanted to do was to shine a light on the issues going on in Seattle and to demonstrate that the representatives, the politicians, and by and large the government here have failed their constituency and continue to do so. And not only that, they continue to scapegoat the fact that they're ignoring these issues on issues like gun control. There's absolutely no excuse why a kid should have to worry about going to a park and be concerned with being stabbed by a needle that's thrown in the grass. That's a problem for me. And so it begs the question, do the representatives and politicians really care, or are they grandstanding to demonstrate how progressive they are? But then progress to what? Progress to hell? And I think that's the problem that I'm seeing in Seattle in terms of ideological mindset, is this idea of placing the ideal above the actual issues. But the road to hell was paved with good intentions. And right now, from what I saw, there's a very, very big part of Seattle that's definitely a road paved to hell. The fact that they have to sweep up needles in the streets in the morning before everybody else wakes up and starts their day, that's not progressive. That's destructive. That's a problem. I'm not okay with that. And apparently there's a ton of other people who live in the city who aren't either.
It's never gonna feel like home again.